Hi, my name is Jonathan. I use they them pronouns. I'm a linguistics student, and I want to talk a little bit about the linguistics of passive sentences. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to assume any prior knowledge with linguistics or advanced knowledge of English. And while this video is going to focus on English passives, the framework we're going to build up is how linguists do syntax for all kinds of different languages, not just English. Really quick though, I'm going to explain a single, simplified model of syntax. Syntax is one of those fields with lots of competing theories. Generative Chomskyan grammars, dependency grammars, construction grammars, and all sorts of wild theories. I'm going to try and be as theory agnostic as possible, but we'll be basing this video on something called head-driven phrase structure grammar, which is a generative, non-transformational, computationally efficient grammar. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. If you do find this video in the theory I talk about interesting, I'll recommend some books at the end you can check out. Now, with that out of the way, I have a question for you. What's the difference between these two sentences? If you ask an English teacher, they would tell you that the first one is active voice and the second one is passive voice, but that they mean the same thing. And that's true. But if you think about it, how are these sentences similar? They're totally different. After all, compared to many other languages, English is heavily dependent on word order. You usually have to put the subject first, then the verb, and then the object, like this. Deviating from this leads to a sentence that sounds like nonsense, like Mary the cat petted, or like Yoda speak, patience you must have. Now, in some other languages, like American Sign Language, which I happen to be familiar with, this isn't true. You have lots of available word orders, and other tools like facial expressions, or for other spoken languages, special word endings, that tell you what roles each word is playing. But English, for the most part, doesn't have that, and we rely on word order to tell us how a sentence goes together. But passives don't feel weird like alternative word orders. They're used by people all the time, and we barely notice them. In fact, I used one just now. But why? Why do passives feel natural or even invisible, but other reorderings of words don't? To understand that, let's consider a different problem. What if you wanted to find the subject and object in the sentence, but you didn't know any of the words? However, a helpful friend has labeled the type of each word for you. N stands for nouns, V stands for verbs, D for determiners, which are those words that go in front of nouns like the, and stuff like that, and ADV for adverbs, which are verb modifiers that usually end in ly, like quickly. You might think, this is easy. Just group all the words on the left side of the verb as the subject, and all the ones on the right side of the verb as the object. But that starts to break down when the structure is more complex. For example, the sentence here has an embedded clause and there's two verbs, which is the main verb. How do we group the subject and object here? It turns out there is a better way. And this better way not only helps with our tangent, but with our original problem of understanding passive sentences as well. When linguists want to understand the structure of a sentence, we turn to a tree diagram. A tree diagram might look complicated at first, but it's really just a way of showing how the bits of a sentence go together. The beauty of these tree diagrams is they will not only help us untangle the subject and object in these complex sentences, but more importantly, they'll lead us to a deeper understanding of the structure of these sentences and how the passive construction relates to the structure of a regular sentence. The easiest way for me to explain what's going on here is to show you how I made these tree diagrams. I'll walk you through making some simple trees step by step, and I'll show you that it's actually really easy. We'll start by labeling each word with its part of speech, like we did in the unknown words example. We also have 4 rules, which you can see in the left-hand column. All these rules do is tell us that we can make the thing on the left side of the arrow if we have the two things on the right side of the arrow. So right now we have a noun followed by a verb, followed by a determiner, followed by a noun, followed by an adverb. So which of these rules can we apply? Well, we don't have a VP, so we can't apply the first or second rule, and we don't have an NP, so we can't apply the third rule. But we do have a D followed by an N in the cat, so we can apply the fourth rule. And that gives us an NP. So all we do when we apply our rule is we write the new label above the two input labels and draw lines up to meet it. So the new NP thing we made stands for noun phrase. So a phrase is just a term for something that's the output of a rule instead of something that we started with. So a phrase can contain just words or can contain another phrase and a word. Now, don't get this confused with the phrase you might remember from English class. That's a totally different thing. Linguists love reusing words that already had existing meanings. So, now the set of things we have is a noun phrase, a verb, and an adverb. No determiner anymore because we combined it with the noun into the noun phrase. So, what can we make now? Well, we still can't use the first two rules because we still don't have a VP, but we can use the third rule with our new NP. That rule takes a verb and an NP in order, so if we apply that, we get this, combining the verb petted with the NP, the cat. That makes a VP, which stands for verb phrase, if you hadn't already guessed. Again, phrase, just the output of a rule. However, we now have an interesting problem. We have a noun followed by a verb phrase, which allows us to apply rule number 1. But we also have a verb phrase followed by an adverb, which allows us to apply rule number 2. How do we pick which one to use? Well, let's randomly pick rule number 1 and see what happens. We combine Mary and petted the cat into an S, which stands for sentence. A sentence is a phrase because it's the output of a rule, but we generally don't say the phrase part because there's no sentence part of speech to distinguish it from, like there is for, say, verb phrase versus just a verb. Anyways, notice the problem? We still have words that haven't been combined, gently, the adverb, but none of our rules apply. There's no rule that allows us to combine a sentence and an adverb. What do we do? Well, let's back up and try applying rule number 2 first instead. That takes a VP and an adverb. So we combine petted the cat and gently into a new VP. And now we can apply rule number 1 again, this time with no extra words. What we just did is called backtracking, and it's an important part of this applying rules to make trees process, also known as parsing. The set of rules we use for parsing the sentences are called a grammar. So what does parsing this tree give us? Well, remember the getting the subject from a sentence with unknown words problem from before? Here's the unknown words example from before, but as a tree, and I filled the words in with their actual values instead of the scrambled ones I used before. Do you notice something interesting? Here, let me highlight the words in the object. So the object here is the cat running around the room. What we can do is go up the tree, level by level, highlighting the nodes above each time. What happens is we eventually get to a level where only one node is highlighted and we stop. Notice that this node is the ancestor, great-grandmother in this case, of every word in the object and no other words. So we can use this node as the single label for all of the object words. If we also highlight the subject, you may notice something. Each converges onto just one node, an NP, and the position of that NP that defines the subject and object can be determined relative to the verb. The subject NP is the left sister of the topmost VP, and the object NP is the right sister of the V. Those positions aren't random. They are the natural result of English word order and how our rules are structured. Each SVO sentence that you can parse with our grammar will have the subject and object in those positions. This may seem very tangential to our original question, but this idea about building a tree that has set locations for the subject and object nodes is the core insight for understanding how the passives work. It's actually not a tangent at all. We've reframed our problem from trying to relate two strings of unstructured words to trying to relate two trees with known structures. So what is the structure of the passive we need to compare our previous tree with? Well, this is the tree for the passive version of our original sentence. It uses a few new constructions. The main one is this new PP thing, which stands for prepositional phrase. If you don't remember from school, a preposition is a word like by, from, to, or so on that expresses a relation. We also have a new auxiliary verb construction, where a verb like was combines with another VP. English uses these auxiliary verbs really heavily to convey grammatical information. In this case, it marks that the sentence is passive. We won't worry too much about English auxiliaries in this video because this video is already long enough, and they're fascinating and deserve a video in their own right. For now, though, we'll just accept that this auxiliary is necessary when the sentence is passive. So here are the trees for the original and the passive form of our example, side by side. Can you start to visualize how they're related? To visualize the relation, let's imagine a creature walking up the tree. We'll call this creature Wug because that's her name. Wug always starts on the main verb node and can only move upwards, never downwards. We'll have Wug remember the starting verb. We'll also give her a to-do list. It's a sequence of things to look for while she's walking up the tree. After moving, she'll look at the thing underneath her that she didn't just come from. If it matches the thing at the beginning of the list, she'll remember it as the label attached to it and remove that element from the list. That might sound a little complicated, so let's see it in action. So, as we stated, Wug starts at the main verb, looking for two noun phrases. So, first she moves up to the verb phrase, the node immediately above the verb, and looks down at the thing that she didn't just come from, the MP. So, and she sees it's an MP, and the first element in the to-do list is an MP. So, she remembers the content of the MP as the label attached to it. So the label in brackets after MP is object, so she remembers the cat as the object. And she deletes that element from her list because she's already seen it. So she then moves up again, but this time there's nothing relevant. It's an adverb which is not on her list. So she moves up again, and now there's an MP below her. Well, an N, but don't worry about it. Again, she remembers it as the label attached to it, so there's a subject in brackets after the MP, so she remembers it as subject. And she deletes the matched element from her list. And now, notice that her list is empty because she's at the root node. If the list was not empty, that would mean that there's something wrong with the tree. So this is what Wug got from walking up the tree. And this would also work for a more complex SVO tree. So I'll just run through this really quickly, and you can pause if you want to see how it's working. But what about passives? As we saw before, they have a different structure. So how can Wug extract the subject and object from a passive tree? Well, let's look at that passive tree again. Can you think of what Wug's list would need to look like to get the subject and object from this tree? It's actually very similar. The subject is now wrapped in a prepositional phrase, so the element in our list must be a prepositional phrase as well. And since the object is in the position the subject was before, and the subject is closer than the object, the order of the list is reversed. So notice that the subject label comes first, and then the object. If we walk up the tree with this new to-do list structure, it works very similarly. So Wug walks up, VP is not on her list, so she walks up again. Adverb is not on her list, so she walks up again. PP is on her list, so she deletes it and remembers it as the label. She walks up again. MP is on her list, so she deletes it and remembers it as the label. And we have the same things in the matrix as we did before. All we had to do was slightly rejigger the to-do list. So is that everything? Is it simply a matter of parsing a tree with these rules and then interpreting it with one of these to-do lists? Well, we're missing something important. Those two verbs they're related. So how do we express that relation? The last piece of our puzzle is something called a lexical rule, which takes a word and generates another word. There are all sorts of lexical rules in English which do things like apply tense, but for our purposes, we're interested only in the passive lexical rule. The rule is actually quite simple. It relates the stuff on the left to the stuff on the right. The number tags show when something from the left is the same as something on the right. So all this rule does is add an ed ending if the word doesn't already have one, and flips the order of the to-do, and changes the new first NP into a PP. Pretty simple. If passive verbs are derived from the equivalent active verb, is there some evidence of this process? Is there an experiment that can verify this? Well, with our current technology, it's impossible to prove how a specific model of linguistics is how the brain actually works. Like, we can't dig into your brain and tell, like, oh, you see this word and do this. We can only see very high-level MRI views. However, we can do psycholinguistic studies which give us some clue as to what's going on. So one such study was done by Brain et al., and they conducted an experiment showing that children acquire the passive construction on average later than the active construction, based on a token placing exercise. And a study by Dan Slobin, I'm not sure, but a study by Dan also showed that processing certain classes of passive sentences takes up to 27% longer for people of all ages, supporting the existence of additional syntactic structure. Again, this doesn't prove that our model of the passive construction is the correct one, but it does prove that there's something more complex about passive sentences than active sentences, and our model is one way to explain that. So, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you do want to learn more, the textbook that I used in the class that I took is called Syntactic Theory, A Formal Introduction, and it introduces step-by-step a head-driven phrase structure grammar for English. And by the end, you have a grammar that you can interpret by hand that can parse a decent subset of English. And if you want to see a very complete head-driven phrase structure grammar of English, you can check out the English Resource Grammar at the URL given, and I'll also put this in the description. You can actually go to this website and put in sentences and see the tree output from them and see like how it's going together. And this is an incredibly complete grammar. It's been put together by many people over the course of over a decade, and including my former professor, Emily Bender, who also worked on the textbook that I recommended. So yeah, I hope you found this interesting. I've been Jonathan Vogel, and this is an introduction to the passive construction. Oh, and a totally not tacked on addendum. This is my first YouTube video in many years, and my first linguistics video, but I'm thinking of making some more. I do have a few ideas, maybe on the English auxiliary system and how it relates to Creole languages, maybe on American Sign Language, or some other ideas that I have, but I'm would be happy to hear yours. So if you have something that you'd like to see a video about, please drop it in the comments. My personal area of interest is syntax, so stuff related to that would be best. But really, any linguistics topics that you would like to hear about, I'd be happy to make a video about. And the whole YouTuber, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for watching.